Hello, friends. Pastor Bill Walden here with Build Up the Church. Hope you're doing super great. God bless you. This is a devotional word for July 24th, 2024. It's out of the book of Acts, chapter 27. In Acts chapter 27, we see the Apostle Paul finally leaving the prison in Caesarea there along the Mediterranean coast. He has appealed to Caesar to have his case heard. And so he has begun a ocean journey from Caesarea on the way to Rome. In between verses 1 to 20, you can read it for yourself, but it's very, very difficult traveling. It's a bad time of year in the Mediterranean. There's a lot of uh, potential storms and actual storms. And so at one point, the Apostle Paul has warned those who were in charge to not sail because it would be dangerous as the winter was approaching and storms were more prevalent and more powerful. However, they ignored him and they went on and they sailed anyway. There was an initial favorable wind and they began to sail, but it wasn't long before Paul's predictions began to come true that they were in deep peril, they were in deep danger. I encourage you to read slowly the first 20 verses if you're interested. It was a terrible situation. These were seasoned, experienced veterans, including the Apostle Paul. He had done a lot of sailing in his missionary journeys, and so they knew that they were in trouble. They began to throw the cargo overboard. The boat that he was on was transporting grain. They threw that overboard. They threw the ship's riggings and all unnecessary items overboard. They put down the sail, and so they were just driven by the storm, and they were scared to death that they were going to be shipwrecked. Along the northern coast of Africa, there are sandbars. It gets shallow there, and the sandbars are a number of miles away from the actual coastline. So if you get shipwrecked there, I mean, you're done for. That's it. And yet, God had told Paul that he was going to go to Rome and that he would appear before Caesar. And so there is this duality of reality that is going on. The promise of God that he's going to make it to Rome, but the present fear and a very real and present danger that they might die at sea. We pick up the story here as Paul receives encouragement from an angel of God. It says this in verse 21, Acts 27, verse 21. After a long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them. So the sailors had been so frightened that they couldn't eat, probably so seasick as well. There's no appearance that they were fasting and seeking and praying and asking God for his help. They just lost their appetite and were probably vomiting, and it was just a terrible situation. After a long abstinence from food, Paul stood in the midst of them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss." I don't think he's saying it as an "I told you so," but rather that I have some wisdom and you should have listened before, and my wisdom was proven correct. I really want you to listen now. Verse 22, it says, "And now I urge you to take heart," or be encouraged, "for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship." So there was going to be additional loss, but they would live. Now here's the reason. Check it out. "For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and I serve, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul.'" What does that tell us? It says that Paul was afraid. He was in the storm with them also. He had a promise from God, the other ones didn't. Of all people, he had the most reason to not be afraid, and yet human nature being what it is, he was also afraid. Doesn't mean that he lost his faith and didn't believe he wasn't going to make it, but human reaction just is what it is. And so the angel came and encouraged Paul first. Don't be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. You're going to make it. So first, the encouragement was for him. Secondarily, "And indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you." What does that tell us? Paul had been praying for the 200 plus men on that ship. He was praying for every single one of them to be safe. Physically safe and then spiritually saved. There's no record that they were spiritually saved, but he was praying that they would be physically safe, and they were. Did God need to save all those other men and bring them to safety in order to bring Paul to safety? No, of course not. Paul could have held on to a piece of driftwood and been saved that way, and everybody else could have perished. But Paul was praying for these men in the midst of his own fear and doubt. What a tremendous, unself-centered life he had. He had an others-centered life. And now he's encouraging them. The angel said, "Don't be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you." May it be so that God is having opportunity and reason, because of our prayers for others, to pour out his blessings upon them. Christian, let's you and I be praying. I think for the Christian, probably prayer is one of the most difficult things that we can enter into, and yet one of the most beneficial. James tells us, and you probably know this verse, the effective fervent prayers of a righteous man or woman avails, it produces much. Powerful prayers, the fervent prayers of a righteous man and woman, a woman or man who is right with God, it brings much blessing. Verse 25, Paul goes on to say, "Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God, that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island." And so, as it turns out, they're saved. The ship is lost, but their lives are spared. I wonder if after that first word of encouragement that they took food and strengthened themselves and prepared themselves for the rest of the journey, which was going to be very difficult. The big takeaway on this is that God made Paul a promise, and it seemed like the coming to pass of that promise, of getting to Rome, seemed so difficult. But Paul was right in the middle of God's will, and a terrible storm came up. That happened with the disciples and Jesus as well. But Paul prayed not only for himself, but for the others. God settled Paul's fear and used Paul to settle their fear, and they all survived. If you're a Christian, be remembering the prayers that God has, the promises that God has given you. Be praying, not only for yourself, but for those around you. So some things to think about. Thanks for watching.